Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Joy Bromley. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a certified professional in web accessibility and the manager of digital accessibility and content for the Office of Information Technology at Portland State. Before we get started, I have shared a link in the chat, bit.ly/, and I'm so sorry, I actually updated that after this morning's session. So it's actually bit.ly / capital G, capital A, capital I, capital N -10 things. And the words 10 and things are both capitalized. This should redirect you to an accessible copy of my slide content. I want to make sure folks have access to my content for purposes of following along with adaptive technology as necessary. That being said, hi, welcome to 10 things you can do right now to improve the inclusivity of your digital content. In the description for this session, you may have noted my emphasis on higher education being centered in the dissemination of knowledge, creating and distributing content meant to inform and educate. Show of digital hands or reactions, how many of you have to create digital content regularly? I imagine quite a few. I'm seeing several hands raised. As a part of your job, we're talking about e-newsletters, reports, presentations, mass emails, support content, help articles, how-tos. There's quite a few of us who have to create digital content on a daily basis. We've all created digital content as presenters for this conference. And it's great that we're doing that because digital content has the capacity to be significantly more accessible and inclusive than printed content. One of the most important things we can do as digital content creators is ensure that our content is accessible and inclusive to the widest possible audience. So let's get started. Why? Why is digital accessibility critical to inclusivity? I'll keep this quick, but there are over 1 billion people in the world with disabilities. 1 in 4 people in the US identify as having a disability. And yet people with disabilities are too often left out of the conversation when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. The vast majority of digital content is not accessible to people with disabilities. There's an organization called Web Accessibility in Mind, and they do this annual accessibility analysis of the top 1 million homepages on the internet. And their 2022 study found that 96.8% of the top 1 million homepages on the internet had at least one major accessibility barrier. So not a minor thing, at least one major barrier. And this isn't because accessible design for digital content is impossible or even difficult in most cases. It's simply because content isn't being designed with accessibility in mind, at least not in the sense of meaningful, equitable, and inclusive access, regardless of whether or not a person is using adaptive technology. Everyone processes information differently, regardless of whether or not they identify as having a disability. Accessible, inclusive design means that you're thinking about different learning styles. You're crafting your digital content to be accessible and meaningful to the widest possible audience. All right, that is my 2-minute elevator pitch for why digital accessibility must be a part of the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you're interested in taking any of those statistics back to your campuses for stakeholders, all of my references are available via that accessible copy of my presentation that I shared earlier. And once again, that's bit.ly / all caps gain -10 things with the first letter of 10 and things capitalized. I have a whole presentation on how to make a pitch for institutional accessibility change. So it's ready if you need it. Okay, so how? How do we even start? This is the wild part. Start with just one thing. Any accessibility is better than no accessibility. And I'm going to share 10 things with you today. 10 things that once we break them down are going to sound like nothing. Accessible digital design is so much easier than you think. You're already designing, creating, and disseminating some type of digital content on a daily basis. So you're already doing most of the work. You just need to alter your methods a little bit to be more accessible. You'll be using the same tools to accomplish the same goals, just using slightly different pathways. And I promise you, you'll find that accessible digital design is cleaner, more sustainable, and significantly more usable for everyone. So we're going to dive into one of the digital accessibility concepts I consider most critical. Number one goes to alternative text for images. In that same accessibility analysis of the top million homepages, 23.2% of all homepage images, so not 23.2% of the websites they studied, but 23.2% of all homepage images, 9.2 per page on average, had missing alternative text. Nearly half of the images missing alternative text were linked images that are supposed to direct the user to another space. This is a critical accessibility barrier. We must remember to include alternative text that describes the content and the function for any and all non-decorative images. So you focus on why the image is being included. What's the purpose? If an image is a link, tell users where they're headed. And don't overwhelm listeners with detail. You want to be succinct. You're not giving a visual description of the image per se. You're giving an alt text that describes the content and function. What is the contextual purpose of the image? What is it trying to convey? If it's a logo, what is it a logo for? For example, consider the screenshot that I include on this slide. And this one is a little bit more complex. I wanted to use a more intense graphic. A small section of bar graph representing 3 of the most common WCAG failures in the 2022 WebA Million report. 83.9% had low contrast text, 55.4% had missing alternative text, and 50.1% had empty links. So I'm just giving a succinct, what is it? What is it meant to demonstrate? Now, for other decorative images in this presentation, like the artwork in my section header slides, you'll notice I didn't include a description. Per the World Wide Web Consortium, the official governing body for digital accessibility guidelines, images are typically considered decorative when they're visual styling elements, such as borders, supplementary to link text, illustrative of adjacent text, or identified and described by surrounding text. Number 2 goes to headings. To help users navigate quickly and easily, it's crucial that content be organized with properly formatted heading structure. This means that headings shouldn't just look bigger or feature a bold, italicized, or underlined font. True headings must be coded as such or selected from provided heading styles in order to ensure that adaptive technology will recognize that structure. Too often, headings are either not used at all or they're used inappropriately, and the latter is more common. For example, if the heading 3 option in a given digital environment is visually appealing by default, it might be mistakenly used as a means of emphasizing text. Headings should be used for section titles only. You want to ensure that the main content of each digital resource begins with a descriptive heading 1. So sorry, went ahead a little bit. This should be your first and only heading 1. It will allow screen reader users to easily skip to main content by navigating via heading structure. From there, headings should appear in order, much like the outlines we use to organize academic papers, right? So we've got our heading 1, all subsections begin with a heading 2, and all subsections, so to speak, begin with a heading 3. If you're worried about aesthetics because the built-in heading options in content authoring tools like Google Docs or Microsoft Word, for example, don't fit your design motif, simply update those heading structures to match what you're looking for. And when talking about headings, I should also note that in addition to true heading structure, you might consider providing supplemental mechanisms that ask users that allow users to navigate easily to specific sections in your resource, like an anchored table of contents with in-page links that allow people to jump ahead in your resource. It can make complex digital resources much more navigable. Number 3, and I know we're pushing through these, but I want to make sure to give you an opportunity to hear all 10. And just as a reminder, once again, that's bit.ly/capital gain dash 10 things, and the first letter of 10 in things is capitalized. So you have access to all of these now and after the presentation. Number 3 goes to captions for videos and live presentations. Videos and live audio must have available captions and ultimately a transcript for recorded content. Captions should be synchronized, equivalent, and accessible. This means that automated captioning really won't be sufficient in the long run. You can absolutely use automated captioning as a starting point, but when posting recorded content, you'd need to edit the captions in the recording to ensure accuracy for both content and timing. Alternatively, you can have a vendor create and/or edit captions for you. The great news is that if you already have captions, you likely already have a transcript, or at least it will be a lot easier to generate one. And transcripts are really necessary. A lot of folks think that if we've got the captions, that's enough, but transcripts are actually necessary to make your audio-visual content accessible to people who are deaf-blind and using a refreshable braille display. Audio files also require a transcript in order to be accessible to people who are deaf or deafblind. Audio or text descriptions for any undescribed visual content are also necessary to make a video or a presentation accessible to people who are blind. In many scenarios, this can be accomplished during the design or presentation process through conscientious narration. For example, I might share at this point that there is an embedded video on this slide that we may or may not be watching depending on the time we have remaining after Q&A. This is one of the Web Accessibility Initiative's perspectives videos titled Video Captions. It is an excellent resource, as are all of the Web Perspectives videos, on why captions and really any accessibility components are essential for some, but useful for everyone. Oh, it started playing. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide here. All right, coming in at number 4, we have links. You have to make sure that your links are functional, first of all, of course, and that they make sense of out of context. Link text should be both descriptive and meaningful. You really can't use phrases like learn more, click here, read more, continue, or more information. Visible, selectable text for a given link should indicate the direction in which users will be sent on selection. And it's got to be different from surrounding links as well. URLs as link text should also be avoided unless the URL is relevant content in a resource that may also be distributed in print, for example, or seen as a slide in a presentation. You might say, please refer to the PSU Help Center or go.pdx.edu/help for more information. The actual descriptive link is PSU Help Center, but I've supplemented with a simplified URL in parentheses only because this presentation is going to be seen visually. If I was creating a resource that was going to be distributed digitally and in print like a flyer, that's also a situation where I might use the URL. I've supplemented with a simplified URL in parentheses. Visually speaking, you also need to make sure that active links are not indicated with color alone. Here I indicate a link with both color and underline. This is best practice because color contrast between links and surrounding text will not always be sufficient to indicate to someone with low vision or someone with color blindness that it is an actionable item. Speaking of color, number 5 is color. The rules regarding this accessibility concept are pretty simple. You never use color alone to convey meaning, and ensure appropriate color contrast between foreground and background. Those are the 2 major things. To accessibly differentiate between elements you might typically identify with color, So information regarding transportation will appear in red. Information regarding lodging will appear in blue. You can use headings or accessible tables, lists, and other structural tools to identify them. Color may still be used to supplement decoratively, but it should never be used alone. One of the most common ways in which color is used inappropriately is what we just talked about, for content creators to indicate a link using color alone without another distinguishing feature like underlining. Ensuring solid color contrast, that other major color rule, is pretty straightforward. If you don't have access to the RGB or hex keys for the font color and the background color that you're using, and RGB and hex are sort of unique identifiers for given colors. It's okay if you don't have access to those, because there are so many color dropper plugins that you can put in with your browser to help you determine that information. And then you just input those color identifiers into a color contrast checker, like the WebAIM contrast checker at webaim.org/resources/contrast checker. There you'll be able to tell if you have a contrast issue between your font and background. And once again, all the references in this presentation are in the slides at the end and found at that URL in the chat. Never trust a third party's claim that a given combination of colors is ideal or accessible. For a lot of people, and really most vendors, accessibility still means availability, approachability. It's online, so it's accessible, right? With vendors and sort of, color palettes that they might suggest or offer, and they might even explicitly call accessible, trust is optional, but verification is absolutely necessary. You really are responsible for the accessibility of your own digital content. Sixth, we have lists. This is really a readability consideration as much as a programmatic one. Breaking up your text content with lists is awesome and best practice for technical writing, really draws attention to that content. You just have to make sure they're properly formatted, accessible lists. You would not believe how often content creators organize their content by typing a number or symbol and then simply adding indentation. There are a couple content authoring systems that account for this, and they're like, oh, hold on, we'll fix that for you. We'll turn it into a properly formatted list. But it's also a problem when people paste lists from another location and neglect to ensure that the bullet or number that they're seeing on the screen is more than just a Unicode symbol. It's a relatively serious accessibility issue, since adaptive technology like screen reading software for people who are blind must have some indication that listed content is part of a list. As a sighted user myself, when I see a list of 4 to-do items and item 2 instructs me to navigate elsewhere to fill out this application, I know I need to come back for items 3 through 4 because I saw items 3 through 4. But for someone listening with screen reading software, if the list hasn't been created correctly, for all they know, that second item might be the last item on the list. When a list is coded or created using built-in list structuring tools, screen reading software will announce to the user at the beginning that they've encountered a, quote, list of 4 items. Item 1, it'll read the item. Item 2, it'll read the item. So you know beforehand that it's a list. So my question for all of you is, can you tell the difference visually between the 2 lists on this slide? Visually, they both appear to be a list of 4 items, formatted identically, but one uses true list structure. I went into Google Slides and I selected numbered list. The other is just 4 items preceded by typed numbers. They look the same. I would say they were just as easy to create, but it was actually harder to create the inaccessible list. And it's not fully accessible. So coming in at number 7, we have tables. More than anything else, designing tables accessibly means being selective about how they're used. Tables are often used incorrectly as a design and layout tool. Instead of using built-in column functions, for example, digital content creators often include a table and make the grid lines invisible as a means of, aesthetically distributing content in a given resource. Tables should be used for organizing data only and not as a layout or design tool. This is because tables in general are difficult to navigate via keyboard only. Screen reading software makes that a little easier as long as data is organized simply with properly formatted header rows and or columns. The latter does not happen by accident. You have to indicate in a content authoring tool that a given table includes a header row and or column. And that's actually a really good test to help you figure out whether should I be using a table in this scenario? Because if you try to add a header row and you think, well, there's not really anything in that top row that sort of heralds the information below it in each column, probably not supposed to be a table. This really goes hand in hand with keeping your content simple and readable. But ultimately, you've got to have a header row, header column, and you should also avoid using any merged cells because most of the digital authoring tools that we're using, unless you're coding a web page yourself, if you're using one of the typical digital content authoring tools that we have access to, it just doesn't give you the necessary markup access to scope merged cells to the appropriate header row or column. So it's really best to simply avoid them. Speaking of keeping your digital content simple and readable, how was that transition? At number 8, we have readability. So 10.8% of adults in the US identify as having some form of cognitive disability. We have a responsibility as digital content creators to make our digital content not only technically accessible, so we're talking about headings and table structure, so that people using adaptive technology like screen reading software and keyboards, that's technically accessible. We also have a responsibility to make it inclusive and usable to the widest possible audience. This means intentionally applying written communication best practices. So, using the simplest language appropriate for your content. Seriously, you can get your point across with the fewest number of words necessary in your how-to documents. It's one of the reasons why I'm providing a lot of details for each slide today, but I just put the basics on each slide. And you'll notice, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but you'll notice that I also used a pretty large font because I want to just put the basics on this slide as a takeaway resource for you, because you can look at other resources for the additional language. On the average web page, this is going to be really depressing for all of you. On the average web page, or really any digital resource, users have time to read at most 28% of the words on the page. 20% is more likely. So this is where you really want to think, how can I reduce that introductory text? How can I think about using bullet points? Use columns, horizontal line separators, and empty white space on the page to strategically improve readability. And of course, I'm using empty blue space here in my presentation, but most often in a lot of content authoring systems, we're using a white background. Use images, graphics, and diagrams to dynamically supplement text. There might have been a few of you when I was on that alt text slide that were thinking, whoa, alt text for images. Sometimes when folks start thinking about alt text for images, it's a new concept and it can feel kind of overwhelming and tempting to then leave out a lot of the images that you might typically use. But actually, images, graphics, and diagrams, so important to dynamically supplement text for people with cognitive learning disabilities or simply different learning styles. You just have to remember to include that alternative text. And finally, proofread for misspellings, grammar errors, and broken links. This is just good design, but it's also accessible, inclusive design, since misspellings can dramatically affect usability for screen reader users and Broken links cause usability issues for everybody. At number 9, we have typography. So I told you we were going to talk about font size. The importance of clean, accessible typography has probably crossed your mind before. Working in higher education, it's one of the reasons we don't use calligraphy or Comic Sans in professional communications. So I'll keep this simple. Avoid serif fonts and all caps, outside of obviously explained acronyms. For people with learning disabilities like dyslexia, fonts with clean lines and no embellishments can be easier to read. Times New Roman is an example of a serif font. It's more compact, and the tails on serif lettering can sometimes make the text run together. Verdana is a sans serif font that's a little cleaner. The one thing to watch out for with sans serif fonts is that you need an option that still clearly differentiates between similar characters like the capital I, lowercase letter L, and number 1. Same goes for capital letter O and number 0. That's why Verdana is one of my favorites, because it's nice and clean, simple to read, but does differentiate between those similar characters. The up-down cadence of title or center or sentence case can also be easier to read than the block-like shape of words that have been typed in all caps. So definitely more difficult to read when you go to a web page or a resource where you've got like a whole paragraph in all caps. Also, kind of feels like someone is shouting at you. So for font size, best practice is generally to use 12-point font or larger for documents and general digital resources, and 24-point font or larger for presentations. I know 24-point font is big, but it's more accessible for a lot of reasons. For people with low vision, of course, but it also forces you to keep the amount of information on your slides limited. And that is going to make your content more readable and engaging. All right, last but not least, at number 10, we have properties. Properties are often something you don't need to think about in a web content management system where you have little control as a digital content creator over language attributes. But PDF flyers, or those printable but generally digital fillable forms, you have to think about properties. I should pause here and note that you should really have a solid business use case for using PDF versus a more sustainable HTML format. I know that's a very hard statement to take in higher education. People love their PDFs, but PDFs are very difficult to maintain over time and correlatively complex in terms of making them accessible. Think about the number of PDFs that you may have inherited from a predecessor in your department, and you're tasked with updating something on it. Where is the original? Was the original a PowerPoint, maybe an Adobe InDesign document, Microsoft Word? It's probably buried in an internal drive somewhere, difficult to find. When a document has been designed in an inaccessible content authoring program, or it's been designed in an accessible content authoring program, but without all of the concepts we've talked about today in mind, and then you have this PDF, it is very difficult. It's possible. There's some excellent help articles on how to remediate PDFs. But if you've been there and you've done that, it is just incredibly time and effort sensitive. So I definitely recommend working with HTML formats or other formats that are going to be sustainable, easier to update. You always have access to the original. You can make changes and updates and not break the accessibility. HTML is just really always going to be more sustainable and much easier to design and maintain with accessibility in mind. Okay, I promise I'm done with my PDF soapbox, but if you ever want to hear more about PDF accessibility and all of the pain involved, I am happy to talk to you about it. It's one of the reasons why properties are crucial to keep in mind, because you're not always dealing with pre-templated HTML environments. You need to validate your code and your properties in any space to ensure that you have a descriptive title and that the language attribute is defined accurately. If your language attribute indicates that your content is in English, but it's actually in Spanish, screen reading software is going to destroy that for the person listening. It's really important that the language attribute clearly indicates to the software that someone might be using, because you don't know who's engaging with your content, that it is in the language that it's meant to be read out loud. This is especially poignant for content that includes excerpts in another language, because you have some content that needs to have one language attribute and some content that needs another language attribute. In these cases, all language must be defined appropriately. Okay, so I added this slide, breathe, because this feels like a lot. But each one of the things we talked about has a dramatic impact on the inclusivity of your digital content for people with disabilities. If you come away from this presentation remembering even just one of these with enough detail to apply it to your digital content authoring process, that is such a big win. But you also have these slides as a takeaway resource, including references, which for those of you who are looking at the presentation on your personal computers right now, you'll notice there are 5 slides of references for this presentation. One of those reasons is because references, obviously, for digital resources include URLs, and using a 24-point font to make sure that this presentation is fully accessible. So you're welcome to use those and explore them. So you might come away remembering one of these concepts, but you can reference this resource and start thinking about how to apply all of them to your process. When you start practicing these and applying them to your digital content authoring, you'll find that it's not going to add a significant amount, or in most cases, any amount of time to your authoring process. You're already creating a list. Just create it using the tools that make the list accessible. You've probably already used heading styles before. You may have used them inaccessibly in the past, but now you know how to use them accessibly. It's really a matter of doing the things that you're already doing as a content creator and just remembering to apply those accessibility concepts to make sure they're accessible to people with disabilities. I definitely encourage you to read more and definitely think more about accessible, inclusive design for your digital resources. It really will make them more inclusive and usable for everyone. All right. Time for questions. You'll notice that I left quite a bit of time for questions. I try to do this anytime I'm talking about digital accessibility because it's a pretty technical topic. So I want you to feel free to unmute and ask a question or post a question in the chat, whatever folks are most comfortable with. Looks like we've got a raised hand. Go ahead, Marissa, and then after Marissa, looks like Rachel raised their hand as well.
Thanks. Sorry, my daughter was crying while you were talking about the HTML bit instead of using PDF. I'm just curious about, for example, like if you post something, like you publish it to HTML, and then you need to make an edit or something, is that easy to do, or is there just like a ton of HTML links that are left over?
So I think it really depends on the content authoring program. I typically choose at PSU, we've got our public facing website. So it's a content management system that uses Drupal. We also have an internal content authoring tool that we use, Confluence through Atlassian for creating help articles. I'm always going to default to tools like that or to Google Docs. Google Docs is a quick and easy one to do as well. If you design your Google Doc accessibly and then you publish it as HTML, so you go to File, Publish to Web for your Google Doc. That's one of the easy go-tos I recommend to folks if they don't have another quick and easy HTML content authoring system available to them, because it is so easy. You need to make an update. You literally just go to the back end of the Google Doc, or in my case, a Confluence article or a public-facing web page, make the change, republish. It doesn't change anything, right? The link is still the same. The link that you gave to folks. I gave you all a bit.ly link to my presentation. If I saw a spelling error in my presentation, I could go fix it right now. And I think it takes 5 minutes to update, but in 5 minutes, it would be updated and you'd all see it. So much easier than when you've got a PDF. Because Adobe Acrobat Pro wasn't meant to really edit the content. It's a finishing tool, and it is a lot of effort to retroactively make something accessible. Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm really excited about how digestible the content is, and it makes me feel empowered to be able to implement a lot of the top 10 just kind of easily. So thank you for that. And this piggybacks off of Marissa's question. Forgive my ignorant question, but with the HTML, the PDF to HTML, what does that look like for the end user? So for instance, if I have if we have the student code of conduct and we've got it as a PDF link, if we change that to publish as HTML, I guess when you said HTML, I thought you meant, oh, just make it as another web page, but that's not what you're saying. Yeah.
It is actually, absolutely. The best, most accessible option, I always encourage folks to consider web pages when they're talking about, web content for their university, and they're deciding whether should I put this content directly on the web page versus create a non-HTML resource that I upload or link to. Always default to HTML. Google Doc is an option now that they have that published to it's sort of a fake TML, because it's not exactly HTML, but it functions like HTML for an end user. It's more sustainable for you as the content creator because you can just make a quick update. PDFs, because they're a static resource, with the original has to live somewhere, has to be stored somewhere, then typically has to be edited in the original authoring tool and then republished as a PDF. And the reason why it's so difficult is when you publish something as a PDF, even if you design it fully accessibly in the original content authoring tool, you're in Microsoft Word, you're using all the concepts that we talked about today, you publish it as PDF, you still have to do remediations in Adobe Acrobat Pro to make that PDF fully accessible to someone using screen reading software. Making a PDF accessible before you post it online is hard. It's work and it requires remediation. And I've been doing digital accessibility work for over 10 years. So I'm really good at it, and I hate remediating PDFs because it takes me so long to make them accessible. So that's one of the reasons I really encourage folks to steer toward HTML, because most of the time PDFs are just posted inaccessibly because people don't know how to make them accessible. So they upload them and they're a real problem for people with disabilities.
Okay, so if I were just to do like one sheet thing instead of doing a PDF, which everyone loves to do, as you've said, it's just their favorite thing, I think. And I saved it for web as HTML. That's not creating a branded page within our site. That's just creating a link that I can share that's readable online. Is that right?
Well, I think I might need to unpack the question a little bit more. What do you mean by saving to HTML? Do you mean that you're using a non-HTML resource like a Microsoft Word document and you're saving it as an HTML file?
Well, for your example, you said in Google Doc, and you can save. You said you can save as or export as an HTML or something.
Yeah, it's sort of a compromise in a situation where you've got like a flyer that you
Got
want
it.
to
Yeah,
that you want to be able to print and distribute in print, but you also want to be able to distribute it digitally.
yes.
It's a compromise I often suggest to people when they're like, oh, but I want something that will, that will that I can print in the back end, but that I can also share digitally. And that's something you can use Google Docs to do, because you can print it as the author and it'll come out looking like a, like a PDF flyer, but you can also post it and it'll show up digitally as the web page. The issue there is that it's not going to print for if end users tried to print it, it prints weird because it's like a web page and it prints like narrow and a little strange. There's definitely some business use cases where a PDF is the right option. A flyer is really one of the primary business use cases for that, but you really have to do your homework to make sure it's accessible.
Okay. So when in doubt, just make another website page with all the content on it. That's better.
Always. Web pages, so much better, so much more sustainable, so much easier for you as the editor. Absolutely. I do see a follow-up question in the chat with PDF to HTML. What does that look like for the end user? And I think there might have just been some misunderstanding there, and that was probably my fault for the way I phrased it, but there's not really a conversion from like in Adobe saving as a PDF to HTML. There might be, but I can promise it wouldn't retain the accessibility formatting. So it's really kind of a one or the other. Do I create something in an HTML format, like on a web page using a web authoring tool, versus a non-HTML authoring tool like Microsoft Word or Adobe InDesign? So there's a lot of resources out there to walk you through how to create. If you're going to go for non-HTML, like how do I create it accessibly in Microsoft Word and then export it correctly? Because there's a very specific export process that will retain the formatting from Microsoft Word. And then you have to have a copy of the paid version of Adobe Acrobat Pro to then do remaining steps. So there's a lot of content authoring tools out there that are not Microsoft Office or Adobe InDesign. And I can tell you they won't actually, most of them will not retain accessibility features, and it'll be even more work when you get to the Adobe Acrobat Pro stage. Any other questions? I know we just have 5 minutes left. I want to make sure to have some solid setup time for the next presentation. So any other questions that folks have? Morgan.
Hi, thank you again for this this information. I was looking at the tables slide, and forgive me if I missed it, but talking about the avoiding merging cells, was that for the scoping part of it? Is that for screen readers or something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the problem is, it's not that merged cells as a concept is a problem for people who use adaptive technology like screen reading softwares, if a table is coded correctly. But the problem is that unless you have backend access on a website, like you're the web developer on a WordPress site, and you can go into the backend and you can change the HTML to indicate this header cell that is scoped over 2 columns applies to both of these columns. You have to actually tell it in the HTML code, indicate this header cell applies to these 2 columns. Unfortunately, in the content authoring tools that most of us have access to, where we create tables, so again, Microsoft Office, Google Workspace, whatever content management system you use for your website, we don't typically have backend access. In those non-HTML tools, there's no option to do this at all. And in our HTML tools, we typically don't have that backend HTML access. So unfortunately, there's no way for most of us to make merged cells accessible. So since we can't make them accessible, we shouldn't be using them. And the reason why all of that scoping is important, why it's important for the underlying code structure behind a table to understand which header row, which header cell applies to each column, is because imagine as a sighted user, you approach a table and you're looking at a random cell. Maybe there's a bolded piece of data in there that you're really supposed to pay attention to, and that is best practice for tables, is to kind of bold the pieces of data there that you want to draw folks' attention to. But you see a bolded piece of data. All you have to do as the sighted user is glance up from that cell to the top of the table, glance to the left. What is it, right? What is 43? and you go up and you see 43. The number of cups of coffee that Michelle drinks in a month. That's a low number. It's a problem for me. But you can see when you're using screen reading software, the same is true for the way you're using your screen reading software if the header row and the header column have been designated and scoped correctly, and they're automatically scoped correctly in a situation where you've designated them and there's no merge cells. If there's merged cells, not scoped correctly. But with your screen reading software, you can use keyboard shortcuts. You hear the number 43, and then you use your keyboard shortcuts, and it'll automatically read the header cell associated with that cell, both for row and column. So I would hear March, numbers of coffee cups that Michelle drank. 36, it's a better month. Number of coffees that Michelle drank in April. So you would hear them. So that's why that scoping is so important. And I think in the future, maybe when content authoring tools get a little bit more accessible, maybe we'll have an option to scope those merge cells correctly. But right now, we just really don't.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
We have one more minute. If anyone else has a last burning question. Well, I just want to take a moment to thank everybody again for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. I look forward to connecting with any of you if you have any additional questions. So you are more than welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. Search for MJ Bromley, BROMLEY, or reach out to me via email at mjbromley, BROMLEY, @pdx.edu. Thank you so much.